Are you someone whose hips feel tight? Trying to move my pelvis around this fixed femur, really trying to make that ball and socket joint work, and you're trying to get them loosened up, or that feeling of looseness. I want you to try these 3 movements to encourage rotation and get some blood flowing in those hips. It may make you feel a little bit fluid and may help your back feel a little bit better as well. So we're going to start with just a standard shin box rotation. So I'm in this kind of seated position. If you can't get here, you can sit on some pads. I've even had my taller athletes, my basketball players, hold a TRX overhead and their body's just kind of like dangling off the ground a little bit. So from here, I'm thinking nice and tall, and I'm going to think rotate, keeping the focus on staying as upright as possible. When I see people doing this movement often, you see their back rounded because they can't get into the position. Their hips don't like it, and they start scooting across the floor. Use your hands to kind of prop you up. If you can't get in this position, maybe your butt is kind of floating off the ground, and you're using your hands to kind of help guide. So for this, I'm cueing, try to keep your heels in the same spot as you rotate. But remember, we want to keep the main thing, and that is focusing on the rotation through internal and external rotation occurring at the hip joint. So I'm just kind of exploring that hip joint, using my hands to kind of guide that posture to help us keep the main thing, and that is rotation through the hip joint. So now that we've kind of moved around on the ground, challenge that internal and external rotation, one that I always like to do to give us some added tension through the torso is this wall hip rotation. So I'm going to get into this kneeling position here, and I'm going to squeeze my glutes, and I'm going to find the wall with my hands. From here, I'm locking everything down. I'm thinking tension through my shoulders, through my abs, everything as tight as possible. And from here, I'm going to think, don't compensate. So I'm going to focus on my left leg. So I'm going to try to not twist to the side, and I'm going to try to not turn my body. Nice and tall, squeezing my glutes, and I'm going to think up and around, and I'm going to hold this hip flexion position, and I'm going to put it away. Try to take a big circle with this knee up and around, hold it, put it back. Nice and slow, pushing into the wall, using it as a guide, holding this hip flex position. But basically, I'm just moving this hip, challenging internal and external rotation. Really trying to make that ball and socket joint work for rotation. And remember, more isn't better. If you're in this position here and you can barely pick it up, that's okay. Maybe you need to stand up and do it because you can't get that rotation from this kneeling position. You don't have that much. Stand up. It doesn't matter. We're just trying to move that hip joint through rotation as much as possible, and whatever we can do to start the process, great. Don't try to jam your body in an exercise that maybe isn't best for it. So the first 2 movements, we're kind of feeling that hip joint. First one, rolling around on the ground. The second one, exploring rotation of what you have with a little bit of tension. And now I'm going to add a little bit more tension by having a closed chain movement. So I'm going to go foot on the ground, other leg elevated. So single leg deadlift pattern, single leg RDL, whatever you want to call it. I like a slight bend in the knees because it allows me to sit in this hip a little bit. I'm going to think fixed femur, drive down through the ground, and I'm thinking active foot. So my whole foot's on the ground, driving my toes into the ground, big displacement of the toes. And from here, I'm thinking polish this ball and socket joint. So I'm trying to move my pelvis around this fixed femur as much as possible. So if the top of my femur was a bowling ball, I'm just polishing it with my pelvis. So I'm loading that tissue, but once again, I'm still just exploring the rotation of that hip joint. Like 8 to 10 of these, just kind of feel it. Make sure we're not feeling this in the lower back, that we're really trying to keep the intent on the hip joint. When it comes to the hips feeling tight, sometimes rotational stuff like this feels good. It allows us to kind of release some tension and may give you the feeling that, oh, my hips feel loose because I'm moving them now. And sometimes we may need to imprint more strength. So I have some other videos that talk about the importance of strength training on the hips. Make sure you follow those because that may be what's holding you back from your hip mobility. But remember, think about what's going on with the torso, active control with the abdomen. Think about the role that the pelvis plays with our hip mobility and challenge rotation of that joint.